I recently surveyed some young people about which Bible study they'd be interested in hearing. I wasn't surprised that one of the subjects that came up was the homosexual lifestyle in today's society. Almost everywhere you turn, you see some reference to LGBTQ plus in today's headlines, in newscasts, in newspaper and magazine articles, and really even in our schools. It's a subject that creates a lot of division and animosity between the two groups, those who support it and those who don't. It matters little how I feel about the subject as an individual, and it equally doesn't matter how those who believe different than me, how they think on the subject. The only way that we can really get to the bottom of whether this should be accepted or denied behavior is found only in the Bible. If we can find the subject there, we can find the principles, the illustrations, and the examples in the Bible that show what God thinks about the subject of LGBTQ plus. We found an Old Testament reference, and it's very clear on the subject, and it's very powerful. Nobody ought to disagree with the meaning of this word. That word's found in Leviticus 18 and verse 22. Here's what it says: "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." So first thing we do is we look up the word abomination. What does it mean? Well, Strong in his Dictionary of Biblical Words said that abomination is a disgusting thing. It really doesn't get any clearer than that. And it should go without saying that any honest individual seeking truth would define the Bible definition of abomination as some good character trait. And yet the world seems almost equally divided. Half of them say it's a good thing. The other side are taking the side of the biblical definition that it's a disgusting thing. Before you turn your device over, do something for me. Don't quit listening to this lesson and understand that what I'm saying is not what I have said, but what God has said. And if you have an argument with what you hear in this lesson, it's not me that you're at odds with, it's God. Now, some people are going to argue and they're going to say, well, that's an Old Testament concept that you have read. It's never meant to be a guide for Christian living today. Okay, I'll give you that much. It was an Old Testament theme that the Bible writers are dealing with. And we don't live by those principles and laws and what have you anymore. We would live by them in principle form, but not the exact law. And when we look at it, some may argue that this is an Old Testament concept, is never meant to be a guide for Christian living today. Well, in his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul deals with the subject in terms that mirror those of the Old Testament. Romans 1:22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed beasts, and animals, and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness, in the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who changed the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. For this reason God gave them up to their vile passions. For even their women changed the natural use of what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burning in their lust one for another, men with men committing that which is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And finally in verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do things that are not fitting. You know what? I ought to be able to stop right there. And an individual that has a good heart and enough education that they can look at something and try and figure out what's being said, I shouldn't have to say anything else. You ought to be able to look at those passages and come up with a right conclusion. I don't think anybody would argue with words like uncleanness. It's not a good word. Nor dishonor, or vile passions, or against nature, nor shameful. Those things would never be used to describe an individual with high moral character. In fact, when we look at these words, the opposite is true. If one is seeking truth, one would have to weigh the righteousness or unrighteousness of the subject of LGBTQ plus based on these words. Most people look at this subject with an emotional tilt, concluding that it's just not fair to deprive an individual who would participate in a lifestyle they desire. However, there are many lifestyles condemned in the Bible that we don't argue about. The only way that we can determine right and wrong of any subject is, what did God say about this subject? So in conclusion, I will say the only way that we can determine what is said about a subject is that we're going to have to take our Bibles and we're going to have to let God tell us what he thinks. And then we're going to have the resolve and the faith and the dedication to simply take God at his word, what he said. Whether we agree or disagree, it doesn't matter. We just simply take God at his word. Thank you for joining today, and we'll see you again in a few days.